Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to Abhishek and all the staff at MAP for such a warm welcome. And I'm so impressed with this institution. It's a real addition to the cultural life of Bangalore. So I've been involved with Indian art and travelled to the subcontinent for a very long time, many decades. I first came to India in 1980, and I've noticed quite significant changes over the years. And I haven't actually been to Bangalore for about 30 years, but I can see all the changes that have happened. And there's an awful lot going on here, which is great, mostly great. Some slightly strange buildings appearing here and there, but this is one of the most distinguished, I think, of the new buildings that have appeared. Well, there's a huge variety of art forms that you can find on the Indian subcontinent, of course, and many of them are represented here: painting, sculpture, metalwork, textiles, and architecture. But there's very little awareness of the ceramic tile tradition. And this is something which I dimly became aware of when I started looking at tiles generally. I was working, first of all, on my first book, which was on Syrian tiles, but I was aware of the Mughal tiles, a small collection of which are on view in the gallery in the Victoria and Albert Museum. The distinctive warm tones, you can see an example here, and then these two, which are in the Victoria and Albert Museum in the Indian galleries, very distinctive and very unlike, really, in the colours used, the tiles that you see elsewhere, mostly in the Islamic world, Persia, Central Asia, and quite naturalistic floral forms in the painting. But what I didn't realise at the time was that the tiles on view in the Victoria and Albert Museum are really just the tip of the iceberg. And these two tiles are typical examples. And in fact, the great majority of tiles in the museum's collection are from just two buildings. On the left, we've got a tile which came from the Asaf Khan tomb in Lahore. And on the right, we've got a floral tile from the famous mosque and tomb of Madani in Srinagar, both dated around 1645. And the tiles from these two monuments completely dominate the collection in the museum. And I think it just shows how it is possible for museums perhaps sometimes to give a misleading impression of the totality of particular art forms, because these tiles were available in the 19th century. They were being sold to British visitors. And also they're obviously visually appealing, perhaps in a way that some of the other tiles weren't. So the museum ended up with a very limited range of tiles. There are, of course, a lot more in storage, but many of them still come from these two monuments. So in a way, one's got to be a little bit aware that museums can direct your train of thought to what they choose to display. So I found this quite interesting to see these tiles and wanted to know more about it and started investigating the subject. And what I'm hoping to do today is just give you an idea of the huge variety of glazed ceramics from the subcontinent, all the different architectural contexts, techniques, designs and colours that you can see, and the great range of different places all the way across the subcontinent, and the different patrons who were involved in commissioning these decorations. So how do we define Indian tiles, or tiles from the Indian subcontinent? I think most of us think of a square glazed ceramic cladding on the wall, but there are many different types, of course. In the context of the Indian subcontinent, we're talking about glazed ceramics produced roughly between the 14th and the 18th century. So we get wall decorations, but there are also tiles that went on roofs. I'm not talking about the plain terracotta roof tiles that you see everywhere, of course. I'm focusing tonight just on glazed ceramics. But you also get floor tiles and other types of glazed architectural elements. Some of them structural, such as here. You can see some glazed bricks in Bengal. Both of these images are from Bengal. We've got on the left a detail from the Latan Mosque, which we'll talk about more in a minute. And then on the right, a false window. It's shaped like a window on the side of the Gumpty Gate in Gur. These are both in Gur, in fact. And they both date from around the end of the 15th century. And you get tiles inside and outside, and floor tiles, roof tiles, but the great majority we'll be talking about today are on walls. So why do we see tiles? They obviously, in the Western context, we see them as a sort of practical object. But I think in the South Asian context, we're thinking mostly of the decorative aspect, particularly the non-fading colours, because ceramic glazes don't fade. And so they're ideal for in the blazing Indian sunshine. They keep their colour. They do unfortunately weather, as you'll see quite a bit later on, but they do have a particular quality which you don't get with painting of enduring colours. There's also the matter of fashion, because it has to be said that glazed tiles are not an indigenous art form to India. They were first seen elsewhere, Anatolia, Iran, and Central Asia. And I think there is a sense that this was a style which there was a desire to emulate in India, particularly amongst the new Muslim rulers who came in from the 13th century onwards. Just looking at some examples now of other wall tiles. These are some rather nice ones on the tomb of Ibrahim Qutb Shah in Golconda, dating from about 1580. And these are mosaic tiles. We'll be talking a little bit more about the technique in a minute. But quite a rarity are these glazed roof tiles in Fatehpur Sikri, which people don't really tend to notice because everybody thinks of the warm red sandstone and the carving. But up on the roof of the palace of Jodhbai, from the time of Akbar, of course, 1572, are these very unusual glazed tiles which give a slight sense of North Africa in a way. Glazed roof tiles are not really that common in India at all anyway. Even on the domes of mosques and tombs, they do appear, but in quite a limited way. So it's definitely not the main type of glazed ceramic that you see. And it's interesting in this context that in Humayun's tomb in Delhi, there are glazed roof tiles on the domes, but not the main dome, which of course is clad in marble, but they're on the subsidiary Chatri domes. So they were obviously not considered sort of totally mainstream. Floor tiles are also relatively rare in India. These are two examples from Gur in Bengal. A fragment of rather nice scale pattern in the royal palace in the centre of the site. And then a restored patch of tiles in the Latan Mosque, which was the mosque that has the glazed bricks we were looking at earlier on. These both date from around 1500. In some of the great tombs of Multan, now in Pakistan, you do see quite often glazed floor tiles. But the trouble with tiles from the Indus region is that it's a continuing tradition, and it's very difficult to tell what's old and what's new. And they do tend to wear. So it's very likely that the floor tiles are 19th century, if not 20th century. But I think you can still deduce from that tiles were used in that architectural context of flooring. So the earliest type of tile that you might see in the subcontinent are monochrome, plain tiles, just one colour, most commonly cobalt blue. But you can see here an example. This is the Shish Gumbad in Delhi, about 1490 in date. And there's a little bit of turquoise as well, which is the other most common colour on the earlier tiled monuments. Quite a restrained use of tiling. And in these early buildings, it was really just a sort of emphasis on the building rather than an extensive decoration. These are on a little visited monument in the Punjab, Talanian. They stand out very brilliantly against the brickwork, but of course we do have to remember that you can see traces of plaster stucco here, and they were probably painted originally. So the blue wouldn't have been quite as stark against the background. Here we've got both square tiles lined with those little fillets of tile, rather like the building we were just looking at in Delhi, but also glazed bricks, which again, the bricks are not entirely glazed, but there's just a sort of line of blue to provide a bit of architectural emphasis. So square blue tiles and glazed bricks are one thing, but quite quickly there was a need to bring in a little bit of variety to the tiles. And an obvious thing, particularly in the Indian context, was cutting, because of course the skills of the local craftsmen were primarily cutting stonemasonry and carving, obviously sculpture, but also just decorative carving. So it came very naturally to start carving tiles. On the left, we've got just an example of a cut tile in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And on the right, the tomb of Sheikh Yusuf Qatal, 1526, which gives you an idea of the sort of context for these tiles. They're usually just one colour and cut to shape, and just a sort of addition to the architecture, which is primarily in carved stone. And it's interesting too, on the next, this is the outer gate to the fort at Agra from Akbar period. And we've got inlay. You can see on the right the detail of the decorative inlay. And I think most people would feel that that is white marble with a bit of blue glaze detailing forming the borders. But in fact, when you get up close to these, you realize that they're white glazed ceramic. And it's not immediately clear why white ceramic would have been used in Agra, of all places, where marble is king. But it's quite interesting that they decided to do that. So you do, during this Akbar period, you do get small amounts of tile inlay to decorate the walls, but it's very much one of many types of inlay, the glazed ceramic. As well as cutting tiles into different shapes to inlay in the stone, there's another technique which is very little understood, which this is unfortunately quite an old photograph taken in Orcha. And there's a very good reason why it's an old photograph, because very sadly a lot of this decoration has now gone. The whole of the left portion of this frieze has now disappeared. But it's quite an unusual technique, not much seen even outside India. Across the Islamic world, you don't really see it very much. It's called engraving, and it's where a square tile has been carved on the surface. The glaze has been carved away to leave the pattern in blue. So the effect is similar to a shaped tile, but it's all actually a series of square tiles which show this rather charming, slightly folkish frieze with various animals. You can see a pair of birds on the left, and then a lion further to the right, and a tree. This is just quite a small patch, but I expect there was a lot more of it originally. And probably these plain tiles to either side are replacements, which have replaced a much longer continuous frieze. This is on the parapet of the Jehangir Mahal in Orcha, which dates from around 1610. This is not a very common technique, but you do see it in Gwalior and one or two other places, but it's used to a much lesser extent in Delhi, as we'll see in a minute. The other way of using tiles that have been cut is this sort of geometrical inlay. And of course, you can use different colours side by side, and this became increasingly popular in the period of Jehangir. This is the Fatehbad Sarai in Punjab, about 1606 in date. And you can see it's quite a sort of typical Islamic design, which would be very familiar to people in the Seljuk world in Anatolia. But the difference here is the colour, and I think this being India, lots of colours very quickly kick in and become ubiquitous on these buildings. I think the sarais, a whole series of, I suppose the early equivalent of motels, dotted along the trunk road between Lahore and Delhi and on to Agra, they're very little visited, and they're really rather nice places because they're nowadays a big courtyard with a garden and then just gates arranged around, very nice, peaceful parks. And they do have some of the best preserved tile work in that part of India. But the most popular type of tile work that you see in the Mughal period is mosaic, cut tile mosaic, which, unlike the slide we've just seen, the colours are not separated. They're put right up next to each other. The tiles are cut and then fitted together like a jigsaw. And this is the Khairul Manazil Mosque in near the Purana Qila in Delhi, and it's just from the beginning of Akbar period. And you can see that we've got tiled mosaic around the archway of the mihrab and these borders as well, but it's combined with carved stucco work. And also we do have a little bit of engraving that I was talking about earlier on. You can see the flowers on those borders have been scooped out, and they were never filled with anything. They were just, it was the intention to show the natural colour of the ceramic body underneath. And then you've got further carving above on those, the merlons at the top. But the great thing about mosaic tiles is that each piece, each colour was still a monochrome piece which could be fired separately. So it meant that you'd always get the very best colour in the firing, because the problem with polychrome painted tiles is that it's all fired together, and so you're not always necessarily getting the right firing temperature for the individual colour. So it's a bit of a compromise. They have other advantages, which we'll talk about a bit more in a minute. But the real zenith of craftsmanship in terms of cut tile mosaic is during the reign of Shah Jahan. This is another sarai near Amritsar, the Amanat Khan Sarai, dated 1641. And you can see here, again, the sort of glorious colours and designs, quite sort of formal, but also a hint of naturalism as well in the decoration. And a lot of earlier people who studied tiles had always assumed that these pieces were placed straight onto the wall. That actually would have been quite difficult to do because getting the accurate fit with the mortar drying as you do it and cutting them all to shape on the spot would be quite a task. And in fact, research, not in India but in Iran, has shown that in fact the way they did it was they laid them out face down on the ground and placed onto a drawing of the pattern, and then they made panels roughly 2 foot square, and then packed on the mortar behind, and then placed them on the wall like huge tiles in each section at a time. And of course, that sounds rather a fiddle, but in fact it was a much easier and more effective way of making sure the end result was the very best. This is obviously much weathered now, but it's one of the most interesting tile buildings, the Chinika Rauza in Agra, the tomb of Afzal Khan, who was actually the brother of Amanat Khan, who built the sarai we were just looking at. It's quite interesting to see with the weathering, actually, because first of all, you can see more clearly the division lines and how the ceramic has been cut. But also it's interesting that some of the colours have weathered better than others. And you can see here the blue has survived much better than any of the other colours. It's sadly not much visited. Obviously in Agra, the Taj Mahal steals all the thunder. And this is in a sort of much less visited part of the town. But I mean, I do recommend it very strongly if some of you have never been before. It's another thing that's quite interesting about it is architecturally, it's very simple, lots of flat surfaces, apart from these gentle pilasters at intervals. But all the sort of architecture is subsumed to the 2D design of the tile work, and there's still quite a lot there that's still here today. But as I say, it's not very much visited, and it's quite different from the crowds you get around the Taj Mahal. But I think talking about mosaic, cut tile mosaic in India, the very greatest example is also remarkably little visited, but it's very well preserved because most of the tiles are indoors, and it's in a sort of working religious building, the Ashokana in Hyderabad. And the tiles are slightly later than the building, but only by a few decades, probably about 1610. But the precision of the cutting, you can see on the left a detail, I mean, it really is quite remarkable. And the richness of colour, and I'm sure you wouldn't be surprised that this is what I wanted to have for the front cover of my book, because it really is quite splendid. But again, very, very little visited. In fact, the taxi driver in Hyderabad hadn't heard of it and didn't know where it was. So I've talked about cut tile mosaic, and the crucial thing about it is that the tiles are fired first and then cut, because then it's hard and you can get a very precise edge that can then fit together nicely. But there is another way of doing it, which of course is quicker and cheaper, which you do see particularly in the Indus region. And of course that is cutting the clay while it's soft and then glazing it and then firing it as an individual object and then placing it together. But you can see immediately the drawbacks of this, which is that the pieces don't fit nearly so well. This is quite a late example. This is from the shrine of Shahbaz Qalandar in Sewan, and the tiles are probably early 20th century, but still they're very much in the traditional style, and they could easily be 100 or 200 years earlier. And they do illustrate the point of the cutting before firing, and you can see very clearly the difference. These are also the local type from that region of slip glazed tiles, which you don't see so much in India, but the Sindh potters who came to Mumbai in the 19th century, the Bombay School of Art pottery very much uses this sort of slip painted technique. So I want to talk a little bit more specifically now about painted tiles, which of course is the other major category of tile work in India. Obviously, practically speaking, there are lots of advantages from using painted tiles. It's quicker. It gives more freedom for the artist to paint the design rather than being constrained by the limits of the tile cutter. And also the tiles can be repeated in squares because the design doesn't necessarily need to follow the shape of the tiles. So it's much easier to actually produce the physical tile. The disadvantage, as I mentioned, is although the colours are pretty splendid here, it's much less, much more difficult to achieve those very brilliant, bright colours that you see on the cut tile mosaic. This is in a technique which is represented by those two tiles I showed at the beginning in the Victoria and Albert Museum called cuir de seca, which literally means dry cord, and it's seen in other parts of the world. But the key thing about it is that the colours are hemmed in by a black line, and lots of people prefer to call it black line decoration, but you can see the yellows and the greens are kept separate by this resistant line made of a manganese oxide, and it stops the colours merging together. But very unusually, and only in India, this technique is also mixed with a bit of sort of shading which gives a sense of depth, and you can see the colours are not all separated by black lines. The big flower, white flower, details are actually painted on a single colour, and you can see this sort of shading effect on the petals of the other flowers, which gives it a sense of depth and makes it a bit more like a proper painting rather than just a decorative pattern. And the equivalents in cuir de seca technique that you see in other parts of the world, such as Iran and Central Asia, don't really have this extra dimension. So I think that makes that's something very unique about the cuir de seca tiles produced. These are mostly Shah Jahan period. This tile particularly is also one of the type that comes from Srinagar, the tomb of Madani. This is also cuir de seca, and this is actually much closer in colours and the way it's painted much more simply, quite crisply, much more related to Persian glazed tiles. Again, cuir de seca technique, we can see the black outline, that the colours are clearly separated, and there isn't any shading here. We don't know who the tile makers were. This is at Datia, the Govind Mahal in Datia, again 17th century. But it's actually remarkably close to the tiles that you see, certainly in terms of colour, during the Safavid period in Iran. But really very nice. Obviously, again, slightly weathered. That's one of the best surviving complete tiles. About 1620. This is another group of tiles on the same building in Datia, some other patterns. I had to photograph this from quite a distance, so the definition's gone slightly. But again, cuir de seca technique, outlined in dark black lines. And then over there, we've got some other patterns as well. Very, very fragmentary now. And also combined, as you often see during this period, with painted decoration as well. The painting is on the lower tier and a bit more protected from the elements. And just to show you the comparison, this is from the Ottoman green tomb in Bursa, about 100 years earlier than the examples we were looking at. In fact, 200 years earlier than the last one, 1421. Quite a sort of formal design, but this is one of the sort of prototypes, I suppose you might say, for the cuerda seca technique. And they're, again, mostly square or reduced square tiles that have been painted. And you can see the colours are actually remarkably similar to the Dacia, the first of the Dacia tiles we saw. But cuerda seca is only one technique, and it made quite a brief appearance in India, and there aren't very few examples still to be seen on the buildings. But a variation which is quite similar is what you see in Bengal, which is basically just the same, but without the black line and allowing the colours to sort of mingle a little bit more. And you'd just call this colour glaze decoration. This is a Merlon tile it's in the, actually this one's in a private collection. There are quite a few examples in museums from Gur. Again, it's probably around 1500 in date. And the colours have blended a little bit, but it gives overall a little more, slightly more spontaneous, maybe folkish effect. And the technical quality is not quite the same, but nevertheless, they're very, very sort of charming tiles, and they've got great appeal, actually. Again, a lot of the glaze has been lost now in the buildings in Bengal, but it's very nice when you've got an example like this that you can really examine closely. So we've had a quick look at the different techniques of tile, and I want now just to focus a bit more on how they're used in architecture. So let's just go back. There's one other technique which I nearly missed, which is underglaze painting, which is the technique that you would see on Chinese porcelain. This is probably the most favoured with tile painters and artists, because it's the closest you get to the situation an artist has with a white canvas and you just paint on it. It's on a white slip, primarily with blue and other coloured oxides. And this is one of the finest examples of this technique in the subcontinent at Ashtur outside Bidar. Bidar really is an amazing place to visit if any of you have not yet been there. But again, remarkably little visited, but it's got some superb monuments and some of the finest quality underglaze painted tiles you'll see anywhere in India. You can see the very crisp designs. These are produced in the mid-15th century, so they're quite early as well. And Persian craftsmen were brought in by the Bahmanis, and it's very likely, at least, that these tiles, the decoration was supervised by Persian master craftsmen. And in fact, they have signed their names on some of the other monuments in the area. Quite a Timurid influenced design as well, very close to the sort of decoration you might see in places like Herat. The main place today, other than the fine examples in Bidar where you would probably see this underglaze painted technique, is in the Indus region. And these are two examples from the 18th century in Sindh. On the left, we've got the Durga of Abdul Latif in Bitshar, and on the right, one of the tombs in Multan. And you can see, again, get a sense of the flexibility which this technique gives the artist. You can paint any design, and they're produced quite quickly. It's quite it's good that these two buildings, we know that the tiles are 18th century, but a lot of the earlier monuments, of course, the tiles have been replaced. But most of these are pretty much as they were in the 18th century. Some of the designs are obviously quite Mughal, and other design, Mughal influenced at least, and other designs such as the geometric border you've got on the slide on the right are probably much earlier designs that have been reproduced over the centuries. So I want to just focus a little bit more now on how tiles are used in architecture. And as I said at the beginning, the earliest buildings, it's very, very sparing the way tiles were used. This is quite possibly the earliest tile building in India. It's the Idgar at Rapri, which is not far from Agra, dated 1312. So it is extremely early. And I think what's interesting here is the tiles are clearly not serving any practical function at all. They're very much a visual thing to give the building a bit of outline, and very sort of minimal use of glazing, but just to give the building a little bit of emphasis. And this is something we see in Multan as well, a little bit more elaborate, but again, as I was saying, you can't be sure these tiles are all probably almost all quite a bit later replacements. But again, just generally as a point, the use of tiles is quite restrained and mixed with there's lots of undecorated brick showing, or carved brick. But the glazing is just minimally used to give the building a little bit of emphasis. The same sort of thing we can see at Mandu on the mid-15th century monuments. The glazing here is used to give a bit of form to otherwise flat surfaces. And I think it's not fanciful to think of the blue here as indicating the sky beyond a battlement. You can see above the Mehrab the sort of little triangles of blue, which you could imagine a sort of view out to beyond battlements, and you've got those square shapes below, which are, or cross shapes below, which are of course the archers' spy holes to fire arrows through, if it had been a real military battlement. And on the right, the Mosque of Malik Mughis, which we've got a sort of Jali window effect. Again, we can sort of imagine a pierced screen with the sky showing through in the background. And most familiar of all, of course, is the Man Mandir at Gwalior, with the false battlements, but lots of other things going on here, and a very bold decoration making a real statement. And this is probably the most famous, of course, tile building in India. And I think if most people are thinking about Indian tiles, this would be the first building they would think of. But this was influenced by probably by the tile work we were just looking at in Mandu, which is probably about 50 years earlier than this. But it gives you a sense of the sort of adventurousness and the idea of making tiles that can be seen from a great distance. And this is taken a little bit further in the wall at the fort in Lahore. And it is known that the Mughal emperors were very aware of Gwalior and were impressed with it. And I think they probably had it at the back of their mind when they were putting together the picture wall, which is not just decorative tiles, but it includes painting and also there's a little bit of texture as well. You can see the carving along the top frieze with a geometric design. But most interesting of all, of course, and most which draws most people's attention, are these panels loosely modelled on Indian miniature painting. And the very charming scenes, but quite, when you get up close, you see they're quite, not sort of very detailed, but they're the important thing is that you can see it from a distance, and it gives you this idea of strolling round a picture gallery and looking at all these scenes which are mixed in. So it's a sort of architectural equivalent of looking through an album of miniatures and enjoying all the scenes. Going back to Bidar, you can see another bold colour statement on the outside of a building. This is the Madrasa of Mahmud Gawan from 1472, and it's again got some of the most amazing coloured tiles, and only on the front of the building, on the facade, probably as much as anything because of cost, but also the idea with this type of building that it's all about the facade. This, of course, is only half of the building because it blew up in an explosion, I think about 100 years later. I can't quite remember the exact date, but so this is just one side of it. But you can really get an idea of what it must have been like when it was completely covered in tiles, because you can see right down to the bottom of the building the outline of tiles. And also, unusually, there are two different techniques at work. You've got the mosaic tiles with the inscription frieze at the top. And then lower down in the spandrels of that arch in the image on the right, we've got underglazed painted tiles, like the ones on the tomb that we were looking at a minute ago. And I was talking about painted tiles being a bit limiting in a way because of the single firing with different colours. They got round this problem part of the way in Bidar with, on that, you can't really see very easily there, but there are some little yellow bits around that archway, and they've been separately fired, cut to shape and inserted in the painted tiles, because obviously the firing of the yellow must have been a bit of a problem. And so to get the very best tone of yellow, they fired separate pieces and slotted them in. Well, this at first sight seems like a sort of very worn out building, but you have to really look at it to imagine just how extraordinary. This is the Latan Mosque again in Gur in Bengal, and every single bit of it is or was glazed. And we've got these wonderful glazed bricks on this end of the building, on the western side, and all the surface. I mean, the bits that aren't glazed are just simply worn away, but it was totally glazed. And then inside as well, you've got these wonderful glazed bricks in much lighter colours, obviously, because it's quite a. I mean, there aren't many windows in the building, and giving a sort of impression of lightness inside. It really is the most extraordinary building. And then, of course, we've got the floor tiles, which we were looking at earlier on. So even though it's worn today, it's the most extraordinary place. There's one building, this is the tomb of Asaf Khan in Lahore, which I mentioned quite a lot of the tiles in the Victoria and Albert Museum come from. And I think an interesting thing here is that you've got two techniques side by side, and for a very practical, sensible reason. You've got, on the lower portion of the vertical part of the wall, you've got painted cuir de seca tiles, very much the type we were looking at a minute ago. And then above, where you've got the very complex soffit of the arch, with lots of different angles. Obviously, flat painted tiles wouldn't have really worked very successfully. So the designer switched to mosaic tiles. And so you've got the two styles side by side, which is slightly odd in a way because they do have a very different effect. But nevertheless, it's very practical. And you can see also that the white divisions between the panels of tiles, which are replicating marble, they are also just white glazed ceramic tiles. A rather sad footnote to this is you'll quickly see these are the same views 20 or 30 years apart, and you can see how greatly the buildings deteriorated in the more recent photograph on the left. That photograph on the right was taken in the mid-1980s, so not so long ago, but there's been huge losses since then. And we're going to come on to that in a minute. But I just wanted to talk also about other architectural uses of tiles. The dado, which is a very common architectural feature in architecture around the world, basically a lower portion of a wall, treated separately, largely for practical reasons, because of the wear of people walking past. This is the tomb of Jahangir in Lahore, and you can see, you can just imagine streams of pilgrims coming to see the tomb, brushing past, and it made perfectly good sense to cover the surface in glazing. Meanwhile, up above, the less worn, wearable areas are painted. And of course, painting is much cheaper and easier to do, and much more flexible too for the artists. So there'd be a definite preference for painting where possible. But the tiles were used here perhaps in a more practical way than you'd see on some of the other buildings we've looked at. And there are some similar ones in this very unusual group of tiles in Aurangabad, the Bibi Ka Maqbara from Aurangzeb's time. There are really no other tiles like this in the whole of India, and so they're really totally unique. They're only in the gateway leading onto the garden, and perhaps these rose bushes here give one a sense of what's to come in the ornamental garden people are just about to walk into. And I suppose the gateway was quite a busy area with people gathering. And so again, there's a practical sense to protecting the walls from too much wear and tear. But the way these are painted with the white ground and the, I mean, obviously the rose bushes, the style of it is familiar, and you might well see designs like this on cotton textiles, but they're as ceramic tiles, they're very, very unusual and beautifully painted as well. And then these rather nice green scrolling borders as well. And then the last example of this sort of thing is Goa. And then these are rather, there isn't really time to go into the fascination of these tiles in Goa, which again are totally unique. This is in the convent of Santa Monica, again, early 17th century. But the tiles are thought to be quite a bit earlier, and certainly in technique, they're on red clay. They're very much the Indus Valley Sindh type of tile, and almost certainly they were produced there. And one of the theories is that they were booty when the Portuguese actually sacked Tata in Sindh in the mid-16th century. And it may well be that this is a group of tiles which were stolen from a workshop, perhaps in Sindh at the time. And there were, none survive today, but there were similar tiles in one of the churches in Vasai, just north of Mumbai, which of course also was a Portuguese settlement. And these tiles, Portuguese obviously are famous for their tiles, and there are Portuguese-made tiles on the nearby church of St. Augustine, but these are clearly locally made, or at least made in the subcontinent. But the full story about them is still really to be told. But they're, again, very unique and very interesting. The one on the right is in an American collection, but there are obviously the tiles in the convent, and there are some others in the Museum of Tiles in Lisbon. So finally, the subtitle to the talk was A Vanishing Legacy. And I mean, I don't want to be too gloomy, but it is it is obviously a very threatened art form, and there are lots of reasons for this. I mean, there's not much we can do about the weather raining onto, the extreme weather that you get, which of course erodes the tiles. And vandalism and theft is another problem, which is probably improving a little bit because a lot of these monuments are much better protected than they were. But I think the most serious threat is what's often quite well-meaning restoration, inappropriate restoration of buildings. This is the tomb of Ali Mir Tijara in Hansi in Haryana. And this photograph was taken in 2008. And you can see really quite a lot of quite nice colours here. The building was very run down looking, as you can see, and people living in it. So it needed a little bit of attention. But when we arrived to look at the building, which I was very eager to see in 2018, we saw the finishing touches being, being put together. They were still finishing off with the ladder there. And the dreaded white paint splashed all over the place. And a lot of the tiles painted over, not all of them, but rather a sorry sight, actually. And, the building, I'm sure, now will survive much longer. But we just wish that somehow it could have been done in a slightly more sensitive manner, respecting the decorations. But this is, it is a difficult problem because, we want the buildings to be protected and repaired, but it's just got to be done in the right way. And another case is the Sufi shrine of Bakhtiar Kaki in the south of Delhi, which this photograph was taken about 30 years ago near the Qutb Minar. And again, some extremely interesting and very unique tiles. You can see a small patch there on the right, sort of ogival shaped tiles in yellow and green, decorated in the cuerda seca technique, which were still visible at this time, 30 years ago. And there were also, you can just see behind the shrine, that some mosaic tiles from a slightly earlier period, probably mid-16th century, quite like some of those early Sultanate or early Mughal tiles in Delhi that we were looking at earlier on. But just a small patch around the ablution niche behind this pavilion. And also you can see at the bottom just the remains of a very beautiful trio of flowers in an old cuerda seca painted dado. Quite an interesting and unique site for tiles. And I'll just show you a close-up of these, which luckily were extensively photographed by the scholar Mark Zabrowski in around late 80s, I think. And I was very fortunate to get access to all his slide collection. He sadly died quite a long time ago. But these are, a very sad loss because today, and this is the other detail of the other niche as it was with the earlier tiles. Again, totally unique. You can see some hexagonal tiles with the engraved technique. They've been scooped away, just leaving coloured circles, which you don't see anywhere else, and some engraved tile spandrels at the top. And then this dado at the bottom is modelled on a Timurid building in Iran, but again a much more colourful example than the ones in Iran, but beautiful really. But today all we've got is this mirror glass stuck onto the tiles, and I'm hoping that underneath this bit of whitewashed wall there are still some tiles. I like to think I can just see some colours shining through lower down, but I'm not so sure. But it's all gone, really, and all that we're left with now is the tile spandrels on the right. So, these buildings need to be protected. I think that these monuments we've seen, they're not under the protection of the ASI, so things are a little bit more precarious. But that's the end of my talk for tonight, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arthur, for the wonderful talk. Now we have some time for questions, if anyone would.
Thank you very much for the talk. Quite enjoyed it. My question was regarding the base material of the tiles. Were they all terracotta, or was there different types of clay used?
Well, that's a good point, actually, and I was going to go into a bit of detail about that, but I didn't want to sort of bring in too many different issues. But the earliest tiles in the subcontinent are just red terracotta. And during the Sultanate period, around the Delhi region, you start to see this new material, which was introduced it goes right back to ancient Egypt, in fact, known as fritware, which is a sort of composition material. It's like a very crude form of glass, but it looks like cement. And it's basically sort of compacted sand, quartz-based, and it's got very little clay in it. And a lot of the tiles in the subcontinent are made of that material, but not all. In the Indus region and also in Bengal, they stayed with the terracotta all the way through. And in other parts of the country, Cuerda tiles tend to be red terracotta, and I think that's probably to do with the sort of firing temperatures, because the fritware is fired at a slightly higher temperature. But a lot of the mosaic tiles from the Mughal period are made of fritware. But you see both in India.
Thank you so much. Love the talk. Thanks for that. I had a question about whether you can give us an example of somewhere the restoration is. If you have an example of somewhere the restoration has been done successfully, or you think it's actually worked out?
There's a lot of work. The Aga Khan Foundation is doing a lot of work in Delhi, and I don't know if any of you know the Sabz Burj in the middle of a roundabout outside the Humayun's tomb entrance. That's recently been restored very successfully, and it's just been completed, but I've seen some pictures of it, and it's been very well done. It's a little bit of a shock with restoration, because you get these very bright coloured tiles on old buildings, and it doesn't always feel entirely right. But of course, they have been very carefully researched, and one's just got to remember that the whole building did look like that once. But it's a bit of a shock after you're used to the old weathered monuments. And another place I thought it was a bit jarring is some of the other, Humayun's tomb, for example, the little, which I mentioned earlier on, the little chatteries around the side, not the main dome. They've got newly made, but correctly newly made blue tiles, which also look a little bit strange and take a bit of getting used to. But I mean, I do think it's probably a good thing they've been done. But it's very difficult to sort of get it right, I think, because people who go to old buildings want them to look old. They don't want them to look like sort of modern wedding cakes or something. But at the same time, I think the Aga Khan Foundation has done a very good job of doing the research properly and trying to make it very correctly done.
Thank you, Arthur, for this lovely talk. That picture you showed of that building in Bidar, which half of it you said blew up in an explosion.
Yes.
Looking at the sky behind that picture was the exact blue that they've used in all the tile work.
Yes.
And that's when you could really imagine how it would have looked like a fenestration or something. So I think that picture really explained it well.
Yes, I think so.
I don't think I've ever noticed the sky so blue as really that cobalt.
I was very lucky
Thank you for that.
Because it's been a great problem taking pictures for the book with the Delhi smog, you know, and the morning you have to wait till about lunchtime before you get any colour in the sky at all. And so that's quite a problem for a photographer, especially not a professional photographer too.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I noticed a preference for the colors blue, yellow, mostly, in at least the presentation that you showed. So I was wondering if it's a technical reason or if there was some sort of color symbology going on.
Yes, I mean, the cobalt and copper, which are the two main elements to produce the turquoise and the deep blue, they're both more common and technically much easier to achieve. And so there's a definite logic to why the other colours came in a little bit later. I think you know, it was obviously a new technology. Well, I say it was a new technology in India, but in fact we do have evidence that glazing pottery existed well before the arrival of Islam, but it was quite limited and not really tiles. It was mostly pots and smaller objects. And in the Kushan period, you get glazed paving slabs as well. But definitely blue and dark blue and light blue are the colours that are most easy to achieve.
Thank you, Arthur. That was a really illuminating talk. I have a question because you said rightly that tiles and in ceramic tiles were not native to India as an art form. There are so many material constraints, and of course, terracotta is widely available. But when we're talking about chemicals that we use to glaze, they're not always available in the centers where we see these monuments now. So when these rulers set up, the factories and kilns and workshops, do you know if we have a record of them bringing over these glazes, or were they sourced locally? And to your knowledge, do any of these centers still exist in any shape or form?
To the latter question, I think mostly not. There are very few. I mean, I think the only place where we've got a continuing tradition is in the Indus region. But they definitely specialists were brought in with the during the Sultanate period. Specialists in all sorts of aspects of ceramic decoration, whether it was painting or preparing the glazes, and I think, of course, there is a strong tradition of ceramic tiling of buildings in India, quite separate of the glazing. You know, we get moulded, sculptured relief tiles, which I haven't really talked about today, but so it's not a completely alien concept of putting ceramic attachments on a building. But it's definitely true, yes, that on the technical side, specialists were brought in from elsewhere. And there are some rather isolated bits of documentation as evidence. Certainly with Mandu and Bidar, we do have a little bit of evidence, but not a great deal.
Thank you.
Thanks for your talk. It brought a curiosity to my mind that among the tiles were the ones which are used for, Islamic calligraphy. Would it be a different technique, because mostly the floral and the geometric one are repetitive? But when it's part of a script where it is fixed one after the other but it's not repetitive, is that a more laborious process, or is it a different technique altogether?
It's very laborious. I mean, that huge inscription you saw in Bidar on the madrasa, that's all made up of little pieces. So very laborious indeed, and especially where there's no repetition. So, there's no way around the work involved, and it was a very slow and complicated process. And you can see immediately why the there was great appeal to painted tiles because it was so much easier to produce. And you could do the physical manufacturing of the tile in a repetitive manner, just producing lots of square pieces, and then you were freer to paint in a sort of non-repetitive way as you liked.
So would they kind of place them or write them I don't know.
There would have been, I mean, with those monuments in Bidar, there were designers as well as ceramic specialists. So the designer would come in, you had specialist calligraphers to design the calligraphic frieze, and then it would be done on a sort of template. And,
Yes.
And then they would cut pieces to fit on the template and then base them face down. Very complicated because it would all have been back to front anyway. And then put the mortar on and then put this panel up on the wall. But it was very, yes.
So they
big
won't be
task.
mass produced or anything, or
Those-
and each figure
what they could
is one
What
style.
they could mass produce would be the ceramic pieces which are then cut. But so the actual pieces that are going to be cut could be mass produced. Well, I say mass produced in molds. They could be done in quite a repetitive way. But once you've got this coloured piece that you want to cut up, that all has to be done manually. And
Thank
so
you.
there's no repetition.
Continuity of tradition, and you said you don't think there's a continuity. But when I see them and I see the cobalt blue and the turquoise and the yellow and the green, I'm reminded of the puja pottery or the which still uses those, I guess, colors.
Yes, that is true. I mean, I think it's. I mean, it's not that it doesn't exist now. And of course, there's lots of glazed pottery and tiles being produced in India, but there's a definite break and a revival, I think. Other than certain specific examples, such as the pottery of Multan and places outside, just outside modern India. It sort of stopped and then had to be restarted again on the whole. But yes.
I'm sorry, I have another question. So, my question was related to the people who were commissioning the monuments in the first place. What was their status in society? Were they royal? Are they royal builds, or were they of wealthy chieftains?
The great noble monuments, obviously, they were people very close to the ruling family, but other important characters at court. I mean, for example, those sarais I was talking about on the trunk road in Punjab, they were usually built by sort of people very connected, but not actually royal themselves. They were courtiers.
So the tradition of ceramic tileware was not used in royal builds, or is it just we don't have evidence of it?
I mean, if you could generalise, during the Mughal period, the royal buildings were much more predominantly stone, marble, and carving and inlay. It's not 100% the case, but that's the preference. Whereas, for example, in Lahore, the Wazir Khan Mosque, which is completely tiled, it wasn't built by the Mughal period, not actually built by them.
Okay, thank you so much.